I now recognize Mr. Greenwald for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Cicilline, Ranking Member Buck, members of the committee. Thank you so much for the opportunity to participate in these hearings. My name is Glenn Greenwald, and the work I have been doing for the last 25 years, first for a decade or so as a constitutional lawyer, and then for the last 15 years as a journalist, somebody who has done much investigative reporting that has provoked the ire of many governments around the world, who has co-founded a media outlet in 2013 and helped to grow it through 2020 in this very difficult climate. And as a co-founder of the Freedom of the Press Foundation, devoted to defending the rights of journalists to be free of government retaliation, I have a really passionate and deep and long-standing interest in the issues before this committee. I think as well that this subcommittee has done some of the most important work, particularly with the October report, in documenting the serious menace that Silicon Valley monopoly power has, not just for our political life, but for the flow of information and increasingly other sectors of our life. And I certainly agree with everyone who has spoken before me about the serious problem of particularly local news outlets failing as a result of their inability to find a financial model to sustain themselves in this climate. I nonetheless do have concerns about the proposed solution pending before the subcommittee. If you look at the last 5 or 6 months, I believe strongly that the problem of Silicon Valley use of their monopoly power to interfere in and control our political lives worsened quite severely. 3 incidents in particular that I define and describe in my opening statement, one being what Congressman Jordan referred to as the censorship of what turned out to be completely accurate reporting based on authentic and genuine documents broken by the New York Post, the nation's oldest newspaper, about the front-running presidential candidate in the weeks leading up to the election, by Twitter simply banning any discussion of that story and locking that newspaper out of its account unless they agreed to delete all references to their own reporting, and Facebook algorithmically suppressing the ability for that story to spread, was an extremely disturbing example of the ability of tech giants to interfere in our elections. The same took place with the removal of the sitting president of the United States, which, although supported by many in the United States, was condemned by world leaders, including many who had a very adversarial relationship with President Trump, Chancellor Merkel in Germany, the president of Mexico, French and EU officials, on the grounds that tech giants are posing a threat not just to American democracy, but to world democracy. The concern that I have is that often we talk about the relationship between journalists and the media industry on the one hand and tech giants on the other as a predator-prey relationship where the tech giants are the predators and the news industry is the prey. But oftentimes that's not the case. If you look at the most serious and disturbing instances of tech censorship over the past 6 to 12 months, one would expect, based on the traditional model of news media, to uphold the values that Chairman Cicilline referred to as a free and diverse press, to condemn and oppose that kind of censorship, and yet the opposite happened. Oftentimes, the journalists were not only supporters of it after the fact, but leading proponents of it beforehand, pressuring these tech companies to censor and to silence ideologies with which they disagree or competitors to these organizations. I'm concerned in particular that by empowering a news media that believes not necessarily any longer in a free and diverse press, but in ideological homogeneity, that they can use this new power to impose these values of censorship, of silencing news outlets with which they disagree in the name of quality control. And I'm particularly worried that we have a news media that is becoming itself increasingly concentrated, where the New York Times is essentially becoming like the Amazon of journalism. This subcommittee issued a report filled with extremely promising and I think important solutions to the problem of monopolistic power. And I'm concerned that if the subcommittee instead starts taking a piecemeal approach to appease and aggrandize the most powerful industries like journalists, it could forestall the opportunity to get to the root of the problem that is concerning people across the ideological spectrum, which is the need to apply antitrust laws to these growing monopolies, not in a case-by-case basis, but overall. So I hope the committee stays focused on its outstanding report that it issued. And thanks again for the opportunity.
Are you worried that by trying to remedy the monopolies in big tech, we create greater challenges in the monopolies of big media and make it even harder for independent, gritty journalism to survive?
I do worry about that quite a bit, Congressman Gates. We've listened to many people speak quite accurately about the state of the news industry today, and what we're hearing is not a kind of idealized or romanticized picture that we might like to think about of having a diverse and dispersed power throughout the industry where lots of different voices can be heard, but instead a very concentrated industry, very similar, in fact, to Silicon Valley, maybe a few steps behind it, such that if you empower this industry without including enormous numbers of very clear and concrete safeguards to prevent it, you could very well be essentially accelerating some of the worst industry trends, ensuring that, say, hedge funds who control the industries or media giants that exert overwhelming power like the New York Times or digital outlets can further entrench their power through this negotiating force that becomes an antitrust exemption in a way that I'm concerned will exacerbate the problems the subcommittee is correctly identifying as a problem, but also forestall the longer term solutions of dealing with Silicon Valley monopolistic power that is at the root of all of these problems.
Yeah, and in that regard, you seem to agree with the fundamental premise laid out by Chairman Cicilline and Ranking Member Buck. I mean, you are one of the founders of The Intercept. As a result of The Intercept not liking some of your criticism of the political left, you had to leave the entity you co-founded. You go to Substack to write, and now even at Substack, there are efforts underway to cancel and censor journalists who are critical of other journalists. And so if the remedy that Mr. Cicilline and Mr. Buck have proposed is not the right one, what insight would you offer in order to get at the core problem?
The concern I have is that the discussion in the legislation seems grounded in a premise that the only or the primary problem of both local and national journalism is that Google and Facebook are vacuuming up advertising revenue, and if that you simply fix that problem, the problem of media failure will be rectified as well. And I don't think that's true. I think there's reasons why consumers have turned away from journalism. I'm concerned that legislation like this can prevent the self-examination of why journalism has failed so many people, why people no longer trust it and put their faith in it. And I do absolutely believe that the problem of Silicon Valley monopolistic power and its ability to interfere in our politics and to impede a free press is a very serious one. But oftentimes it's the media itself, it's journalists themselves who are demanding that that power be exercised in a censorious way that undermines a free and diverse press. And that's why I think that until the problem that this subcommittee identified in that report is addressed head on, which is breaking up the monopoly powers of this industry, none of these problems will really be fixed. And oftentimes these piecemeal solutions can make them much worse by empowering an industry that's causing many of them in the first place.
Thank you for that thoughtful feedback. Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman. I'll submit my additional questions to the witnesses for the record, and I yield back.
Thank you for this most interesting meeting. This first question is for Mr. Greenwald. It's been said about the Newspaper Preservation Act passed back in 1970 that it was removing those so protected from the judgment of the marketplace. It's also been said that it failed to prevent abusive tactics, failed to help the smaller papers, did little to improve the quality of the opinions and writings of newspapers. Can you share with me the difference between that act, the Newspaper Preservation Act, and the bill that we're discussing today?
Well, I think that this goes to the comment that Chairman Cicilline made after the last time I spoke about how more and more people are consuming news than ever before. And I think that if you ask people inside the news industry, virtually everybody will acknowledge that the reason for that is because of what was essentially a sugar high of the last 4 years being one of the most polarized eras in American history because of the person who was occupying the Oval Office being so controversial. And that prior to that, there was a significant decline in the number of people who were trusting and consuming news content. Ratings were collapsing. Local papers were losing subscriptions. People were talking about the New York Times going out of business. And there was a kind of temporary event that intervened to save the news industry. Then that sugar high is now gone. And if you look at data, there's no question that more and more people, more than ever before, distrust the media precisely because so much of the disinformation, conspiracy theories, and falsehoods come not from newly created sites online, but from the very industry that this bill would essentially empower by enabling them to act as a consortium.
What I'm nervous about is this alliance between big government and big tech that Mr. Greenwald talked about. But I also wanted to go to Mr. Greenwald and talk about this other alliance, which I think is just as frightening, and that's the alliance between big tech and big government. Big tech and big government. In your statement, Mr. Greenwald, near the end of it, you said, a mere 2 months after Parler ascended to the top of the charts, members of Congress demanded that Apple and Google remove Parler from their stores and ban any further downloading of the app. We've seen maybe a better example. Just a couple weeks ago, Mr. Greenwald, we saw 2 Democrats send a letter to AT&T telling them to take certain networks off their, not be a carrier for certain networks. And I just want to read something to get your reaction to this. Because Mr. Travis said earlier, Mr. Greenwald, Mr. Travis said, we would all be rightly concerned if government was censoring speech and not big tech. But frankly, it's both. Big government censoring speech too, because we had 2 members, Democrat members of Congress, write to AT&T, and they said, we want a specific answer to this question. How many of your subscribers tuned into Fox News, Newsmax, One American News, on Uverse, DirecTV, AT&T TV for each of the 4 weeks preceding the November 3rd, 2020 election? Please specify the number of subscribers that tuned into each channel. So basically tell us who your customers are, how many you have, and what they were watching. Mr. Greenwald, do you find that a little creepy and frightening like I do?
The time of the gentleman has expired, but the witness may answer the question briefly.
Very briefly, it goes to the heart of the concern that I have, which is I think there's a huge mismatch between the rhetoric that is being offered to justify this bill and what the bill does. If the concern is the failure of local newspapers, then give them the power to negotiate collectively, but not big media, which is so often embedded in the same problems that this committee is discussing.
The time of the gentleman has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. After years of allowing false information about President Trump and the false Russia collusion information that we saw perpetrating across the American sphere, social media platforms then decided to ban legitimate content about Hunter Biden. This is disturbing because it's a reflection of the role these companies wish to play in dominating civic life and public discourse. But at the same time, the Washington Post and New York Times haven't been the best fact checkers. A concern of mine is that in addressing social media's dominance over the news, we will just end up allowing a different set of actors to do the same thing. My questions are for Mr. Travis and for Mr. Greenwald. How can we tackle this issue to create a fair playing field that promotes free speech and does not suppress ideas that are out of favor with elites in this country? Mr. Greenwald, do you want to add anything to that?
Just briefly, that there are representatives of my industry, my profession, here with me testifying. And often what we hear is, well, we're professional journalists. We're here to combat disinformation and ensure free and diverse viewpoints that are aired. But so often the reverse is true. If you look, for example, at what happened in that Hunter Biden banning by Twitter and Facebook, the argument that was advanced by those companies to justify it was that the materials reported by the New York Post were, quote, Russian disinformation. That came from news media outlets saying that, and everyone now knows that that is untrue. Even the FBI acknowledges Russia played no role in that and that the documents were genuine. So often, the most damaging conspiracy theories and disinformation come from the most prestigious news outlets. Obviously, the most destructive case being the claims that were made that led to the country to invade Iraq. And so I think that the concern I have is that if we adopt this narrative that the reason media outlets are failing is only because of Google and Facebook, we allow this industry that needs so much self-examination to essentially be off the hook. And if you allow the biggest players, the New York Times, Jeff Bezos' Washington Post, to be at that table and give them an antitrust exemption, you're essentially creating now two consortiums instead of eliminating the one that's at the root of all the problems. I think it's exactly correct. One of the reasons why I was so excited about the report issued by the subcommittee in October was because it was designed to finally address the problem that is a serious menace for the health of our democracy, which is anti-competitive behavior on the part of one industry. And so to have the solution be to empower another industry that has immense problems of its own and that often works hand in hand with that tech industry, be able to replicate those problems makes little sense to me, especially because the chairman said, and he's right in theory, that, well, if we do this, it doesn't preclude us from then doing this broader agenda. But the political reality is that if you start giving the most powerful industries like the media a reason to stop caring about big tech monopoly because now they have what they want, which is license to do the same thing, you're going to be diluting political support for these broader solutions.
My question is for Mr. Travis, Greenwald, and Smith. If you can quickly just say, what are the things we really should look to make sure that we do not have this piecemeal approach and can create some unintended consequences?
Just quickly say that I first would encourage the minority members of the committee to really look at that report from October, because I think there are a lot of solutions in it that address the primary concerns that are being expressed. And very quickly, until short of that, of breaking up these companies, I think you could apply First Amendment law or other requirements of content neutral moderation along with an appeals process based on the reality that these companies are monopolies and people rely on them for their livelihood and for their expression.
The last thing I wanted to ask maybe Mr. Greenwald, because maybe I think you're probably the best position to answer this, but what's your demographic? Who are you trying to get to? Who do you think is most interested in your content? I have 3 sons, and 2 of them are in their 30s, and 1 is 28 years old. I've never seen a newspaper in their hand, but I've also never seen them without their phone in their hand. So, that's a big part of what this discussion has become, I think, is who are these groups? Who are we reaching out to? And does the media feel a responsibility to kind of, tailor their content to these individuals?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it goes back to the point I and several other people were alluding to earlier about the collapse of trust in media. And I think what you said is exactly right, is that as media outlets have confronted an increasingly difficult climate in which to not just profit, but sustain themselves financially, the model to which they've turned is one which feeds partisan audiences, not what they should hear, but what they want to hear, which in turn erodes trust in journalism even further. And I think that until that problem is addressed in terms of what is journalism and the media industry doing that's causing a loss of trust, even if people are still consuming it, these problems are going to continue to linger, and this legislation might actually make that worse.
The time of the gentleman has expired.
There's been a lot of good questions asked today, and I don't want to duplicate those. So I'm just going to ask Mr. Travis and Mr. Greenwald. This is one of I think of a long series of steps that's going to get us to where we can deal with this process that's been happening to us for quite a while. This counsel culture, counseling a culture, our American culture. How do you see us finally get to that end where we've gotten control? And obviously, this is one of the many steps to get in control to where we can have this freedom of speech again, where we expect this as a country, that this should be a natural process. We can speak freely without feeling of being attacked. How do you see that coming to where we can end this process here in America? Let's start with Mr. Travis and Mr. Greenwald.
The one point I'd like to emphasize, Congressman, about all that is big media, the largest media corporations in the United States, are not opposed to the censorious behavior of big tech. Quite the contrary, they're the ones who have agitated for it most aggressively. If you ask people in Silicon Valley, they will tell you they would, all other things being equal, prefer to be out of the business of content moderation and have been pressured by big media companies, both for ideological and competitive reasons, to silence others who might compete with these large outlets in the name of diversity. And this is why I would really urge the committee to strongly consider this. What I think everyone is saying is very valid in this concern for the viability of local media outlets. So if that's the case, the focus ought to be on empowering these local media outlets to sustain themselves and to grow and flourish, and not empower the actors who are causing so many of the problems that we're all talking about, which are big media outlets either acting in concert with big tech or in many cases co-opting the power that they wield.
The time of the gentleman has expired.